else. We're here today to celebrate two authors, James J. Patterson and Erin Hamburger. I'm not going to talk more about them right now because we'll have a chance to chat in a minute. So let's just go straight to some readings. And Erin, if you want to come up first, the podium is yours.
Awesome. Can everybody hear me? Yes. Thanks, Zach. Thanks to everybody at the Writers Center for putting this together. And thank you to Rose and Jimmy for being here with me today. I'm very excited, as always, to be at the Writers Center. So I'm going to read just in the very beginning of my new novel, Hotel Cuba. And by the way, there are some Hotel Cuba themed milk chocolate cigars at the table. They're not from Cuba. But anyway, please help yourself, and some postcards, enjoy. And there are, of course, books for sale. Just to situate you in this book, about 6 years ago, I found this picture of my grandmother from 1922 in full male drag. And my grandmother was not sort of the type of person to go around in full male drag. She was like a Yiddish grandmother, a bubby. She used to sing me lullabies in her thick Yiddish accent at night, and bake cookies, and I knew her as this sort of sweet, frail old woman, my grandma. And so I wanted to dig into her story and find out what was the story behind this photo. How did she end up doing what she did to get to this point? And that became my novel, Hotel Cuba. So in the novel, I renamed her Pearl, and you're going to meet her right at the beginning. And I'll just pass around this picture if you want to take a closer look. Fish and oranges. A salty sea of soup dotted with islands of potato chunks that Pearl can mash flat with the back of a spoon. Bread so dry, when she dunks it into her lukewarm soup, the stubborn roll remains firm. But Pearl can be stubborn too. She continues dunking the roll until it softens and melts into a paste. It's depressing, the food on this boat they call SS Hudson, heavy on salt and light on pepper, parsley, or any herb to give it character, like the shaggy dill in her yard back in Russia, or what used to be Russia, because this year, 1922, their town belongs to Poland. After a good rain, those dill stalks grow so high they collapse under their own weight. Starving, blue-eyed soldiers from the Tsar's army used to pull them out by the roots, mistaking them for carrots, then fling them to the ground. "Eat," says Pearl, offering an orange to her younger sister Frida, sitting with her eyes closed and squeezing her temples. "Or save it for later." "Don't bother," says Frida. "I won't eat it then either." You can't starve all the way to Cuba. Maybe Pearl sounds more like a nagging mother than a sister, but she quit worrying about her own vanity years ago when Mama died after giving birth to Frida. Though Pearl was only 9 then, people already called her old lady, housewife, empress of the kitchen, Madame Singer's sewing machine. What will they call her in Havana, where no one knows her and she has no history? She might be anything. It's a thrilling, terrifying thought. Before the war, a girl from their village who'd immigrated to America returned to visit as a rich lady. Some women laughed behind her back, mimicked her proud walk, lifted their hair to imitate her short haircut, and called her new woman as an insult. But Pearl didn't laugh. Maybe someday she too would become a kind of new woman, like the shtetl girl who transformed into a prosperous American lady who could afford to coolly ignore the other's jokes as if she didn't hear. Now there was freedom. Frida, who's in one of her states, won't eat no matter what Pearl says. Arguing with her is like trying to empty the ocean with a spoon. So Pearl returns to her own soup. Tomorrow she'll eat the next soup, and then the one after that, and the one after that. In this way, always looking forward, never back, she and this creaking boat will slowly cross the Atlantic, leaving Europe behind. When Pearl finishes her bowl, she's still hungry. She has long been cursed with a healthy appetite. Her solid, sturdy figure bulges in the wrong places for a woman who loves dainty clothes, loves looking at them and making them. Before the Great War, when people cared what they looked like, Jews and Gentiles alike paid her to make dresses sewn with fine stitches you'd need a magnifying glass to see. For each dress she made, Pearl imagined a story, the potential to put on a new outfit and become a new person. But sadly, clothes never fit her as beautifully as they do slender Frida, who even before the boat often forgot to eat. Pearl has never forgotten to eat in her life. During the worst of the Great War and then the Revolution and the war with Poland after, the hunger was so raw it addled her thoughts, gnawed at her stomach lining. On the SS Hudson, many passengers are seasick, like Frida. Pearl squeezes sideways between tables, casually skims stray peas and carrot knobs from abandoned bowls of soup, scrounges a section of orange, a scrap of pinkish brown herring. A willowy lady wearing a dusty pink hat watches her at work, out of pity or disgust. She's a sophisticated city type. Jews are so desperate to leave Europe these days, they cross the ocean in a bathtub. So Pearl sees many grand people like her mixed with country folk in steerage. This lady has a long, lovely face, pale with a pointed chin, and shrewd gray-green eyes like a cat. Pearl noticed her when she came into the dining room on the arm of a young man who pulled out a chair for her. She stepped forward and sat, didn't even look behind her, confident the chair would be pushed in again, and it was. Pearl imagines what it would be like to have that kind of confidence, to sit into air and know that a seat would appear below you. And that hat, it fires up her imagination. If Pearl could afford to wear a fancy pink hat like that, she could walk down the street with such a cold, blank stare that no one would dare bother her. She's known plenty of women who aren't strictly beautiful, but in the right hat or dress, they're magnificent. Their clothes teach the world to treat them with dignity. I'll stop there. Thank you.
And now James J. Patterson, please come to the podium.
Yes, sir. Hey there, hi there, ho there. I loved Pearl.
Oh, thank you.
Well, Pearl made me crazy. Okay. I got two pieces. They should take 3 minutes each. In case you counted. This is called The Memory of Tomorrow. It is 10 till 2 a.m. on a Thursday morning in late January. A winter storm has temporarily cut off the power. Many candles burn. The candlelight loves the heavy red velvet curtains, the cranberry wallpaper with images all the color of copper turned teal green, of nymphs and flower urns. A stick of amber incense adds a subtle sweetness to the atmosphere, an atmosphere that wants poetry and good red wine. Rose sleeps upstairs. The house is quiet. The neighborhood is quiet. In a way, only a slow, heavy snowfall can hush the world. It is the memory of quiet that makes me look up from my book to take in the candlelight. The quiet invokes a familiar feeling. It's a feeling I realize I've had many times before, but once it passes, I forget about it until it returns. And as I return to my reading, reveling in the delicious cadences of long, well-written poems, the ingenuity of revealed wisdoms, the unexpected turns of thought that can surprise even after many readings over many years, I am suddenly aware of a background ambiance. Pausing to listen, I recognize it, a comforting sound, familiar all the way to my bones. I smile and return to my reading when suddenly I have the kind of wait-a-minute revelation that will often happen when I detect something is very out of order. Because the sound that has comforted me late at night at times like this throughout my life is not possible. It is the clippity-clop sound of a horse trotting on cobblestones in the snow, pulling a small carriage in the night. The book I'm reading falls to the floor. Almost worried, partly amused, I stand and walk to the window. I can see snow falling slow and steady between the houses. I go to the front door, pull it open, and step out onto the sheltered front step. The cold is thrilling. Breathing it in has a purifying effect on my lungs. Was I half expecting to see gas lamps out on the street and a carriage coming up the hill in the snow? Maybe I was. But the power is out and all is hush and dark. The snow falling has the soft sound of air moving gently. It tastes like electricity. Sometimes a snowfall like this one actually warms the air somewhat. Friction, I suppose. But it is too cold to stand here all night, although I want to. The veil between worlds has become very thin. How do I know that? Because each of my senses is being called to it. The senses I know and think I can direct, and the ones I'm not aware of. They are searching for a thread after taking a hint. In this state, I doubt anything could surprise me. If an ancestor I've not heard of, maybe one who looks a little like me, male or female, or even some hound or some animal familiar, should step out of the falling snow and hand me something I need or impart a piece of advice or a warning or merely a comfort, I would accept it. If that creature stepped out of the snow and demanded a gift, I would give it. I turned my head slowly side to side, encouraging those senses to reach out and explore. I am tempted to make a slow sideways movement like a Tai Chi gesture, a secret step, and if I do it properly, an open sesame will occur. I will see the Pythagorean angles in time all around, and if I want to, I could slip between them, becoming myself an adumbration, and I would be standing in another time, another now, as another me. This is a piece from The World of Yesterday. My father always said that his first memory was of standing on the couch in his parents' living room, small hands on the back cushion, peering out a picture window at a neighborhood street in Bend, Oregon. There's a slow-moving line of cars and horse-drawn carriages inching its way down the lane. The line of cars is there every day, and every day he stands there and watches. His street is a long one, and at the end of it is the cemetery. He is not allowed to go outside to play. Death is all anyone talks about. Death from a great flu epidemic. Death from a great war just ending. Everyone has lost someone. Everyone has lost someone. Most have lost a few. It is 1918. My parents were born during the First World War, my father in 1915, mother in 1917. I didn't know my grandparents. I was raised on the other side of the continent. When I was in my teens and early 20s, the last of the World War I generation, then in their 70s and above, were all around me and treated with quiet reverence by one and all. Armistice Day, November 11, was still celebrated with great fanfare. On the Lovesick Lake, where I spent my summers, most islands and cottages on the mainland were populated with people from the Between the Wars generation and their remaining elders from World War I. In those years, our summer home on Clovelly Island must have been a comfortable place for the older ones to visit, as most of the look and feel of the place would have been very familiar to them. A big iron and wood barrel butter churn, now used for holding summer flowers, greeted them on the front porch. There was a fully functioning cast iron wood stove in the kitchen that we depended on for our meals, and smaller wood stoves in the bedrooms for heat. Coal oil lamps burned late into the evening. There was a sawdust house for preserving ice, and an icebox instead of a refrigerator in a nook behind the kitchen, away from the heat. A sundial out on the front lawn kept good time. The benches and furniture outside and in were all handcrafted by local folk from local trees and timbers. You know, it was a time when everything in the world was handmade, laughed one old-timer when I pointed out a favorite rocking chair constructed from a collection of hickory sticks and branches. They called me a history buff because they needed an easy explanation for a boy who read all the time instead of hammering nails and tinkering with engines. But it would have been impossible to keep up with the adults around me if I didn't study up on their life and times. Every now and then, while sitting on the porch, playing chess or under a shady tree, watching the world of the lake go by, one of these folks would open up about those days when they were young like I was at the time. So once in a while, during a quiet moment, the right question would open a door. I heard you enlisted. Oh, I enlisted because I hated my father, old Max Risher told me on one of those afternoons. Okay, you hated your old man so much you volunteered to go fight in the worst war ever fought, thousands of miles from home? Oh, Christ, yes, he chuckled. Getting thousands of miles away from him was the reason to do it. He was a right old prick, he was. A farmer. He must have beat me, all of us, within an inch of our lives. I can't tell you how many times. And you thought it's safer to take your chances with the Germans. Hell yes, he laughed. And so father owned the only motor vehicle in the whole township. Had one of the first motorized tractors, too. He taught me to drive so I could be a useful hand on his farm, which I hated. Anyway, as soon as I got the hang of this driving piece of business, I stole his car and ran away. I knew he'd kill me if he found me. So I drove to a recruitment center all the way down in Oshawa and signed up. I was only 16, but I was the only recruit who knew how to drive, so they took me anyway. So they took me anyway. Just before I shipped out, I sold his car.
Thank you both. It was great to hear some readings from those pieces as well. So first thing I do want to mention is we're definitely going to leave some time for questions from the audience. So start thinking of them now, and we'll come back to. There'll be a quiz given by you to the authors here. But yeah, so get some questions in mind, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions. But in the meantime, I have some questions of my own. The first one, I guess we'll start with you, Jimmy, because you're closest. Is who the heck are you?
Says right here. Who the heck am I?
Yeah, who the heck are you?
Who am I? Well, I'm Jimmy Patterson.
Mike.
Oh, whoa.
It's on.
I was born in Washington, D.C. I live in Bethesda, Maryland, the center of the universe. And I never got along real well in school, and I never did good with jobs, although I had a bunch of them. So I figured out I needed to do something creative, so I played a little guitar, and I got into this duet. We were on the road for 15 years and wrote a lot of songs, and it was wonderful. And so I did that, and then, you get older, and that gets old too. And so I quit doing that, and I came to this place called the Writers Center. It was in 1989, and took my first couple of classes here. And I was trying to segue from being an on-the-road musician and songwriter to writing prose, and it was the best thing I ever did. Everybody here were PhDs, and they were great teachers and really nice, and some of them became lifelong friends, and so I've been a devotee of this place ever since, and that's kind of who I am.
And Aaron, who's you?
Okay, I don't have quite as colorful a life, I'm sorry.
But you write fiction, so you can make it up.
Okay, there you go. So I'm a fiction writer. I've written, this is my fourth book. My first book was a story collection called The View from Stalin's Head. And then I wrote two novels. Nirvana is here and Faith for Beginners. And now my third novel, fourth book, Hotel Cuba. And I teach writing at George Washington University, here at the Writers Center, at Politics and Prose, and also the Stone Coast Low Residency MFA program, where I will be a week from today up in Maine. So I write and I teach writing.
Excellent. All right, so the first question about writing we like to ask is also sometimes the hardest, and it's a little bit cheating because Aaron, I think you've gotten this one once already in a previous chat, but so you get to go first.
Okay.
Which is, what's a question you really wish someone would ask about your writing or writing practice? In other words, what haven't you got to talk about before?
So I kind of love the answer that I gave you the last time, so maybe I'll
do it. Yeah.
I love being asked about the sentences, the word choice, the small craft decisions that I make on the page, which are not so small to me, word by word, line by line. And when I was reading from the book in New York, somebody in the audience asked me, why did you write the book in present tense? It's a work of historical fiction that takes place 100 years ago, and it's written in the present tense. And then why did you use third person also? And the reason that I did present tense was because when you're living through history, you're not really aware that it's history. You're just kind of trying to get through your day, and you don't know how things are going to work out. There's a way in which sometimes historical fiction is written when it's written in the past tense, it's implying that there's like this island of safety where the characters have reached, and they're looking back on these events, and everything has turned out okay because they're still alive to tell the tale. And so I wanted to write this in present tense so that you as the reader are kind of almost holding hands with the characters, and you're like, what do I do now? I've just landed in Havana, Cuba, and I don't know anybody, and how am I going to find a place to live, and how am I going to, figure out the language? And so it really plunges you back into the past with the characters and makes you try to live their lives with them. So yeah, definitely those craft decisions are really what excite me as a writer.
I thought when I was reading it, I thought the present tense thing it makes everything so immediate.
Yeah.
And so you're being driven, by that immediacy. It really well done. I can't think of a single thing I've ever wanted anybody to ask me. I'm not shitting. I was the first time I wrote a book. I was out in California and I was doing a reading out there, and I'd never done a reading before. And so I got up and I read something, and I couldn't believe they liked it. And then I went and sat down. And the people said, "Where are you going?" And I said, "I'm done." You're not done. We're going to ask questions. I said, "Ask me questions about what?" And so I sat down, and they asked me a bunch of questions, and I flunked my way through them, and so here it happens again.
So one thing I'm interested in always talking about is sort of how books evolve from the idea to the first draft to the finished product. So I guess, what was the time frame of these books and how did they come together? And starting with you, Jimmy, since
I had nothing to say.
Yeah, because you bailed on the last question, you have to go with this one.
Okay, well, I don't sit down to write unless I have something to say. I never go to the office. I go to my office, turn on the computer, and sit there and stare at it. I usually have something I want to talk about, and I keep two sets of journals. One is kind of a diary, but it's more of a diary of what I'm thinking and what I'm reading at the time. And then I keep another journal of stuff I need to write down real quick. Somebody really, like Aaron here, said something, and I want to write it down. And then years later, I'm flipping through the book, looking for ideas, and there they all are. But with the Junk Shop Window, I was starting a big novel, and I was going into areas where I wasn't really used to, and so as I was struggling with that, to warm up, I'll work on essays, and personal essays, and so. Okay, I'm reading all these books about all this crazy stuff that I'm going to put in the novel, and so I'm sitting down to write, and I'm really confused about some of it, so I'll start writing about those, and that'll turn out to be an essay. Usually I'll finish the book of essays before I finish the novel, and so that's kind of how Junk Shop Window came about. The same way Bermuda Shorts came about too. I was working on Roughnecks back then, and that took 8 years to write, and I can't take 8 years to write anything, because I don't have 8 years to write anything. And so I got Bermuda Shorts while I was playing hooky from writing Roughnecks, and I got Junk Shop playing hooky from writing this current one.
It's a good method. So, as I told you earlier, I found that picture, and this was actually in early 2017, after the momentous election in 2016. I was showing this picture to just everybody. I was like, God, can you believe this? And then there was a group of writers in town because AWP, I don't know if you're familiar with the AWP convention, it happened to be in Washington, D.C. that winter. And some of the writers there said, we want to go to Capitol Hill and knock on the doors of all these senators and advocate for progressive causes because it really seemed like we need to do something. And nobody took Michigan. They needed somebody for the state of Michigan. I was born in Michigan, although I've lived in D.C. for 10 years. So I took my grandmother's picture with me, and I lined up with all these professional lobbyists in their suits, and they had all their branded things and stuff. And then it was my turn, and I met with Senator Debbie Stabenow of Michigan, and I said, hi, I'm a writer, I'm here with this convention, and I believe strongly in the rights of immigrants, and I want you to advocate for the rights of immigrants in honor of my grandmother. This is her picture, here's her story, and I hope you'll do that. And she said, in her Michigan accent, which I know so well because I have it Oh, I agree with you 100%. And I thought, that was the easiest lobbying job I ever heard of. So I said to her, well, what can I do to support you? And she said, you're a writer. Tell your grandmother's story. I thought she was going to say donate to your PI campaign. And I thought, well, I don't typically write historical fiction. But then I thought about it, and all my fiction engages deeply with time and place, just more recent time and places. And so I started saying, well, what if I could? And then I started delving into it. I actually traveled to Cuba. Actually, I would travel to Key West as well, because part of the story takes place in Key West, including where that picture I showed you, it was taken in Key West. Went to the National Archives here, and I really started the writing process, I would say, late 2017, early 2018. And then I sold the book in 2021, and then worked on it with my editor, and then got out into the world this May.
Great.
Nicely done.
That's a good origin story, though. That's like superhero level origin story.
Thank you, Senator Stamina.
Yeah. So, you covered this a little bit, so maybe, is there anything else? My next topic is sort of picking subjects, and maybe it can be this book, which I think you've covered a little bit, but maybe you could talk more broadly about your other books as well. What makes a subject interesting to write about? What is it that draws you to, especially for a novel? You're going to be spending a lot of time, 8 years perhaps, working on that one thing. What is it about a subject that makes it viable to be a novel or to be any kind of project that you're going to work on? Yeah, sure.
I think there has to be some kind of question or mystery that you're trying to solve, or some kind of thing that really fascinates you, preoccupies you, kind of never lets you go. And I think that's one of the things that has kind of, all the projects that I've sort of worked on that have come to fruition, there's always been that sort of central driving thing. Why was my grandmother dressed in male drag, for example? Or what was her journey? How did she get from where she was to where she eventually ended up? And I think too often, I teach a lot of writing classes, I think too often what happens to projects is there isn't that sort of central purpose. And so you end up with a lot of what I call soggy middle syndrome. So there's like this great start, usually a highly polished, like pages 1 through 10 or something, or whatever it is, and then it just kind of founders because there's nowhere for it to go. So it needs that like end point. The writer E.L. Doctorow said, writing a novel is like driving a car on a dark road at night with no lights except for your own headlights. You know the destination, and your own headlights is like enough to get you there. So I don't like to like plot out things too intricately, but I like to have that general sense of like, where is the destination, and the process of writing it is a process of discovery to figure out how am I going to get there.
That's good.
I don't outline anything.
Yeah, I don't know.
Roughnecks is 450 pages, and my outline was 1 page. Mm-hmm. A guy loses a job, another guy gets his job, and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. For me, there's a problem-solving thing about writing. With Roughnecks, this is a story that happened to a friend of mine, and he wanted me to write a book about it, and I thought it would take me like 6 months. It didn't. But he had quit his job at a big bank. He was 26, and he was the youngest vice president this bank had ever had. And he would make foreign loans to foreign entities and countries. And he found out one day that the series of loans that he had made, the money, these were shell organizations, and they had, the money was really going to Contra-like people in Central America and South America who were using it to murder socialists and their political opponents. And when he found that out, he had a crisis of the soul, and he quit his job, and he sold everything he owned, and he bought a Jeep, and he went out to Montana and started throwing shade on an oil rig, and I don't think he was ever coming back. And so I went out and saw what he was doing, and I researched the whole thing, and I thought, well, I'll write a story about his adventure. Well, I got into it, and I thought, well, nothing happened. Okay, he broke his foot, and then he had to go home. And I'm halfway into this shit, I got nothing. But the writing saved it. the writing, my being out there, and I spent a ton of time out there by myself, and I would dress up like one of these guys out here, down here, and I wouldn't bathe for a week or two, he said, whatever you do, you're going on one of those oil rigs, wear a long sleeve thing. And I said, why? He says, because when they see your slender wrists, they're going to kill you. and I went, really? Anyway, so it was the writing that was going to make it interesting to me. And I hope that's what made it interesting to others folks, you know. And all of a sudden, it dawned on me that, you know, all our lives are really interesting. You know, just because you didn't invent the nuclear bomb or something, or climb the Matterhorn or something like that, your life is interesting. And so later I got into creative nonfiction, and I loved the writer Henry Miller, and he invented a form called spiral form, and for his essays, and it's real simple. Let's say you had 3 things interesting happen to you today, and you wrote them down. And the rest of it wasn't interesting. Then nothing happened to you interesting for 3 more days, and then you wrote that down. Well, you have an interesting story if you link all those together and leave out all the stuff that wasn't interesting. And so you take a lot of true things, a lot of things that you know are real, and in spiral form you get them going around and around, and they will tell the story, and so the fiction part is knitting them together. Doesn't matter if a woman said something on Wednesday in May, and in the story it happens on a Tuesday in January, but it's real and it's true. And it will give the writing a real sense of authenticity, and you're really not making a whole lot up except for the bread that the butter goes on. And so that was a real a revelation. And so when I wrote the book of essays, Bermuda Shorts, I thought I would employ that. And then I had some interesting experiences and then with Junk Shop Window, I just wanted it to be straight ahead memoir. But I'm into all this other stuff, and this thing they call speculative fiction is kind of like mysticism and science fiction and the kitchen sink stuff, you know, that they love to write about. So I thought maybe I would take a genuine memoir and throw in a little Twilight Zone, you know? And so that's kind of what it's, memoir meets the Twilight Zone here at Junk Shop Window. And so, how am I doing?
That's perfect. I love that last part. I'm going back while you were talking, I'm thinking essays. Oh yeah. So like, yeah, that's great. I love it. That was a good bit here. Another thing that I was really glad I got to hear you read out loud, because I was actually thinking about the role of musicality in your writing, because you have a musical background. Right. You mentioned 15 years on the road playing music. Right. I'm assuming probably most days you were on the road. So this question is starting with you. How has the musical background influenced you as a writer? And I'm saying my first background was music as well, so this is also just a personally interesting question. And I think about rhythm differently than many writers. I think about music, just the way a phrase works musically different than other writers. I wonder if you feel something similar to that.
It's identical to that, because when you're writing, you sit and read it out loud to yourself, you know, and you go, you might not say these words, but you would know in your head, this doesn't sing. I'm reading it, I like it on the page, but it doesn't sing. And so you know, in a writing song, me and this other guy wrote hundreds of songs, and you know, so we would always keep a little notebook, you know, and you write down a phrase, you know, talk about me at work tomorrow. Don't pretend to make believe. You know, those kind of phrases, you write them down, and then when it's time to write songs, I'd say, well, what have you got? He said, well, I got all this gibberish here. I said, well, that's great. We can match it up with all the gibberish I have over here. And so, but the musicality is really important, and whether you're a musician or not, you know when those cadences are delicious, and you know when they're like grinding rocks together, and so having a musical past really helps me with the sonorousness of the prose, and your prose flows brilliantly. Yeah, and so you don't have to know the C scale to make that happen. But it does. I couldn't imagine myself writing without that attitude. You know.
Aaron, and to you, do you have any musical background or any non-writing things that are influential in the way you think about writing as well?
Well, you know, it's interesting to think about. I took piano lessons for 5 years, and it was a total disaster. It was like
Another writing origin story there.
yeah. But you know, when I think about, okay, what are sort of like the equivalents of music for language and for sentences? You know, I studied with the writer Jonathan Franzen, who he had just turned in this book called The Corrections to his publisher, and I remember thinking, boy, with that title, that book's going nowhere. What did I know? But he was an incredible teacher, especially at the level of the sentence. And so, you know, music is based on a structure, and so is sentence flow. And if you think about things like, okay, what will the first unit of your sentence be? And typically what I see a lot of is like subject, verb, everything else. Subject, verb, everything else. He did this, she did that, John did this, Jane did that. Well, what if you start with a dependent clause? Walking to the store, Jane did this. Or what if you start with like a little phrase? At 7 o'clock, Jane did this. What if you throw in an intentional fragment? What if you think about your sentence lengths in each paragraph? So it's amazing how your unconscious will work. It will literally make paragraphs where every single sentence is exactly the same length. So you start measuring it. And so you start thinking about, okay, how do I achieve a balance of long, medium, and short? And then also thinking about like, where is the emphasis of the sentence? Like, where is that sort of like high note in terms of meaning or content of the sentence? Is it falling in the middle, at the beginning, or at the end? In English, we tend to privilege whatever's at the end of the sentence that carries the most weight. So it's like da-da-da-da-da-bum, you know. And so kind of thinking about that, and sometimes, so like the writer Garth Greenwell talks a lot about inverting expectations with that. So typically in English, if you have a dependent clause, like walking to the store, Jane noticed the verb. The emphasis in the sentence is Jane noticed, the subject verb, not the dependent clause. So what Garth Greenwell will do is he said, no, I'm going to put the main idea in the dependent clause instead of in the main part of the sentence, just to kind of mess with you a little bit. And again, you know, we're used to reading stories. We're conditioned to reading stories, and we're used to looking for things in certain places. So what if you mess with the reader's mind? So all these things are things that like musicians play with, and I think writers play with too, on the level of words and sentences. I was actually an art history major as an undergrad, and I loved visual art, and I was a painter at one time. And
Welcome to our art gallery.
yeah, there we go. I think it's interesting just to see how different art forms are approaching the same sort of problems, but in different vocabulary, the language of color and shape and line. And I also love to cook, and cooking, I think, informs a lot of this book. And then also, one last thing, my grandmother was a really skilled seamstress, and clothing and fashion was incredibly important to her. And throughout the book, you see her evolution as an artist, as a designer of clothing. And a lot of her thoughts about the creative process are really mine, about the creative process channeled through her. In part because my mother said to me, you know, nobody in the family is creative except for you. Where did you come from? You know, and then she's like, you know, my mother, she was a seamstress, she was an artist with fabric. You must have gotten it from her. So I always felt like I was sort of her spiritual heir in a certain sense.
Well, are there any questions in the audience? We have
You did her proud, by the way.
Oh, thank you so much.
questions from the audience? Come on. I can keep
It's always the
asking.
first one.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, there we go. Thank you.
Aaron, I love your stuff because I hear it here fairly regularly. I really enjoyed
Thank you.
your work, and I'm trying to write a historical fiction novel myself, which is completely out of anything I've ever tried to do in my life. And I'm about, 150 pages in, and where the hell do you end? I mean, there's really history there. Where do you stop?
So, I also, when I had not written historical fiction before I wrote this piece, and I went to, and I actually wrote about this in the Writers Center magazine, so everybody should get the Writers Center magazine and see the essay. I went to a reading by Dolan Perkins Valdez, who's a local historical novelist, and she said, when I write historical fiction, I write a draft of my story to figure out what I need to figure out. And that really freed me, because I thought, boy, I have to do all the research first and then write the story. But by writing a chapter and realizing, oh, I need to figure out, how do you make a phone call in 1922? Or, oh, I need to figure out this. First of all, it freed me just to go wherever I wanted to go in terms of the plot, but also it limited the research process, so I didn't go off the rails researching every single thing that happened in 1922. And then this question of where to stop is an interesting one. So the architecture of this plot is my grandmother's journey from where she started in that village in Russia to where she eventually ended up. In early drafts, I took it all the way to the Cuban Missile Crisis, because I thought, boy, my grandmother, she never went back to Cuba after she came to the United States, but she did return to Key West. So part of the story, my grandmother was living in Cuba. She wanted to get in the United States. She couldn't get in. And so she paid an American couple to pretend that she was their daughter and smuggle her into Key West. But the second she got off the boat, she was immediately arrested. She was caught, they knew who she was, and she was detained in Key West for 2 weeks and then eventually deported back to Cuba without a penny to her name. So I thought, how interesting would it be to talk about the fact that my grandmother really did return to Key West years later as an American citizen and what that would be like. But it covered so much real estate, it was so much ground, I couldn't contain it within the story. And the novelist Claire Keegan, she talks a lot about how, what is fiction made up of? Time. Because time is infinite, both in the past and the future. What's the beginning of time? What's the end of time? Who knows? And what a story does is it creates an artificial incision point that is your beginning, an artificial incision point that's your ending, and the space between the two is the shape of your story. So in this case, that shape was 2 years, from 1922 to 1924. The bigger that space is, the harder it is to create drama and tension. The more tension leaks out of your story. So I would say, try to look for some kind of meaningful time shape. Why does your story begin at the time that it begins, and why does it end at the time that it ends, and what is that distance between them? And that'll give you some tension in your piece.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
I just want to make one comment, because I'm writing about now, and my time thing is, I do not want texts in my novel, zero. So I'm going back in time so that's not going to be there, as a distraction.
Right. I mean, Romeo and Juliet doesn't work if they have texting.
Right.
I'm not gay, dude.
I just can't do the texting thing.
Did you have any thoughts on where to end in general, since you've got from an essay to a novel?
It's tricky, and people are fussy about that stuff. Rose has this great novel, A Secret Woman. It's about an artist who has to go and find her lost mother's history or somewhere, and it has a great ending. I love the ending of that novel. But when she was reading it over in England, everybody went, "Yeah, we love the book, except the ending is so neat and clean." New books should end open-ended. The ending should be open. So there's trends in what people like, and it changes all the time. I think if you're a writer, just when the period at the end of the book or the essay will come natural. At the end of this big long book, Roughnecks, this guy's been through all of this stuff in the oil patch. He's seen guys die. He's done all this stuff, and at the end of it, I was typing away, and he's sitting at a bar, and people from his old life come and walk into the bar and don't recognize him and leave. And he looks into the mirror behind the bar, and he sees a completely different guy looking back at him, and they smile at each other. Now that ending happened en naturality. I was just writing the scene where these people were coming, they were looking for him, they'd gone out west to see if they could find him. And they go into a bar, because they knew he'd probably find him in a bar, and they sit next to him at the bar, and he's waiting for them to recognize him. Of course, he's got scars on his face and a beard out to here and an old, smelly, attire and all this stuff. So they just look right through him. And and so the book ended, and I was about to, go down to the next paragraph, and I thought, it's over.
You know, I studied with two writers, Mary Gordon and Mark Slocum, who had but endings is like a big question. And so Mary Gordon would say sometimes pull up short, just a little shorter than you think. And then Mark Slocum would say, and forgive the war analogy here, he would say, pretend you're like a pilot and you have to drop a bomb on the target. As soon as you hit that target, you want to get the heck out of there. And he said, think about ending on an image, rather than like an action or a summary sentence, but just like a really suggestive image, kind of like what Jimmy was just saying.
Yeah, and I like to start stories with a quote, because it's a real great way to lead in. Okay, now you've introduced a character, now you've introduced a listener, now you've got a good start, and ending with an image is a great way to end. Yeah, I agree.
And what you're saying too, just real quick, was so many writers who I know have discovered that their ending was earlier than they've written past it.
Yeah.
That when they're feeling lost, they can't find the endings because they're looking beyond the place where it already ended. So I've known lots of writers who've given that advice. I saw one hand in the back, I think. No? Okay, well then, right here.
But don't the words create the image? I mean, regarding, ending on an image. Like, I'm thinking about what the person said about, I think it was you who said it, that the ending was too tidy. And I think of George Eliot, Mill and the Plus, in their death they were not divided. It was perfect.
Mm-hmm.
And there's certainly an image there.
Mm-hmm.
So I wasn't sure, like, when you were, how literally you meant, ending with an image.
Yeah, well, again, these are all different strategies, and so one strategy might be ending on an image, might work for one person. Jane Austen, not exactly the biggest imagery writer in the world. It's always like shrubbery and well-appointed rooms. She doesn't do the five senses, and she puts us creative writing teachers to shame. What I like to say is, writing, it's not like math, and I can't say always, always, always. I can just talk about tendencies. And so for some people, and yes, of course, words are our DNA. So everything we do, unless you are W.G. Sebald, you're literally putting photographs and images in the text. So yeah, you're using words to create an image. But I think what Mark Slocum was talking about was like literally diving into the five senses, creating like a memorable image that's going to linger in a writer's mind. But you're right, that's just one strategy, and there can be a whole bunch of others.
I used to have a buddy who was a professional golfer. I hate golf, can't stand it.
I'm with you.
But I would caddy for him all the time because it was a fun day. And he'd be sweating bullets out there hitting those things, and I'd be just out having a great time lugging his clubs around. Well, he used to call, when he was really in a good frame with his game, he would call it being in stroke. I'm really in stroke, Jim. I gotta do this tournament because I'm in stroke. I've never been in stroke this good. In stroke, and I thought, when you're writing, you can get out of stroke, or you can be in stroke, And I find that when I'm in stroke, I never want to stop. But if you're at the end, you kind of need to stop. But you can overrun the runway, And so it's good to have a metaphor or something like that to cling to, because just because you're in stroke doesn't mean you need to keep it going.
There's only 18 holes.
36. Right?
There's an image for you.
Anyway.
All right. Other questions from the audience? I know I saw another hand at some point. Someone's become shy in the last few minutes.
Patterson. Yeah. What's your next book gonna be?
I know the guy. Well, oddly enough, it's called, what's it called? West of the Wind is the working title, and it's about these guys in a bar, and they say, write what you know. And they all serendipitously fall into the same adventure without knowing each other is involved in the story that's about to unfold. And that's as far as I can remember.
Aaron, how about you? What's next?
So I'm always reluctant to talk about another project when I'm in the middle of it. But my next book is set in Berlin right before the end of the Cold War and then after the Cold War. So going from Havana to Berlin.
You've gone full Cold War theme.
Seriously.
Is it historical fiction again?
Yes, but not as far in the past as this one. Although interestingly, so my book before this one, Nirvana is Here, was set in the early 90s and is framed by the career of the band Nirvana and Kurt Cobain and their rise and then Kurt Cobain's suicide. And I did as much research for that book set in the 90s in Detroit, a period that I know well because I lived there, as I did for this book set in the 20s in Havana and Key West. So I think it's always important to do research no matter what you're writing, because even if you live through it, you may misremember things or you have your own slant and other people have interesting things to say that can illuminate what you have to say about it.
All right, well, I have another question then, and maybe someone will come back. So I'm just interested in influences, and I think it's an interesting question to talk about in general. So what are your literary heritages? What are the books and who are the authors that you think have most influenced you as writers? And to you, Jimmy, a little bit too, because you actually have a lot of direct quotes and referencing things very directly in the different essays. So we'll start with you.
Well, when I want to when I want to figure out how to write well, there's several writers that I'll go to for their sentences. Cheever's got great sentences. I read Cheever's short stories. I can't tell you what one of them's about. I've gone through that book 15 times. But no, 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 no. The cadence of his sentences I find just mesmerizing. Alice Munro's like that. There's several. So if I'm going to sit down to write, I will read a page or a couple of paragraphs of a writer whose prose I absolutely adore. Why I write comes from people like Henry Miller. I love him. You know, in the first page of Tropic of Cancer, he says, "I have no prospects, no money, no friends, and no hopes. I'm the happiest man alive." A year ago, 6 months ago, I thought I was an artist. I don't think about it anymore. I am. You know, and so when his paragraphs go for pages. I mean, this guy is running on to daylight, and I could never fathom trying to write like him. You know, or Henri de Balzac is one of my favorite writers, and I don't speak French, which is a tragedy, but a pleasant tragedy. But whoever does these translations, it's just amazing. The detail in your book is you're really right there. I mean, it's 100 years ago, and there's no intrusions. You know, it's all those little details of what that life is like. In Balzac's work, you know, he'll be in a carriage going down the street, and he'll tell you how high the mud is hitting the wall as it goes down. Now, he wrote contemporaneously in the mid-1820s, 30s, and so all of his readers would have been very familiar with all that stuff. Today, they would say, well, why tell everybody stuff they already know? Why waste your time with all these details? Well, you know, 200 years later, 100 years later, it's like science fiction. You're going into another, completely historical, you're going into another world that doesn't exist anymore. Like in sci-fi, you're going to worlds that don't exist. And so the difference between those two is where I live. You know? So, did I complete that thought?
Yeah.
Good.
So I am like this total Anglophile. Like when I was a kid, I wished that my name was James, and I grew up in a castle and stuff. So I love British literature. So Jane Austen, George Eliot, you were mentioning, D.H. Lawrence, E.M. Forster. At one point, I thought I was E.M. Forster reincarnated, or was wished. Virginia Woolf, Christopher Isherwood. I mean, all the modernists. I just love, love, love. But then there's this other part of me that loves the Americans, like Hemingway. I remember being 14, picking up The Sun Also Rises, and just thinking, you can sound like that and be literature? I just, you know, it was so, it shattered my idea of what a book could be. And then, of course, writers like Philip Roth and Bernard Malamud and Saul Bellow, you know, the great sort of like Jewish American writers, Cynthia Ozick, Grace Paley, just Lori Moore's earlier work, not so much the later work, and Ann Tyler, actually, a local novelist. I love Ann Tyler's work, and I just think there's so much to learn from her. I think she is so underappreciated because, you know, she writes about peanut butter and crumbs that get caught in the carpet, and people, I don't know, for some reason devalue that, but I really love her writing.
A slightly different take on that. Are there any books that you think these current projects are in conversation with? I mean, in Jimmy, maybe your case, it can be pretty literal because I think that, again, there's direct references. But starting with you, Aaron, is this book in conversation with any other specific books that you think it fits in with or is responding to?
I remember, I'm thinking now, I also left out Katsui Shigeru as a huge influence on me. I mean, definitely, I mean, every sort of like immigrant narrative that you could possibly imagine, obviously, is in conversation with this one. You know, maybe even like the novels of Sarah Waters. I don't know if anyone knows her historical fiction. I'm trying to think what else. Yeah, I just think sort of upending the sort of traditional immigrant narrative and certainly like the Jewish American narrative. And then also the queer narrative as well. I think it's in dialogue with all of that.
Jimmy, any particular conversations in your essays or things you keep coming back to?
I don't know. When I walk into my office and I'm going to sit down and write, you know, there's books on all the shelves. I really feel like all those authors are my friends, and I feel like they're sitting on those shelves and their legs are dangling down, you know, and they're going, Jimmy, where have you been? Time to get back to work, dude. So the conversation is ongoing. You know, there's things I'm mad at that I try not to write too much about. Republicans these days. There's things that I love, and I don't want to write too much about those. But the conversations get started, and I don't like it to end.
I like that.
I think that's all I got.
Yeah. Question?
Oh, I just want to make a comment that you are so alive in the book in that way, the conversations that you're having with the muses that come to you, they're so real, and I love that so far in all the essays I've read.
Well, thank you. And like I do, I feel like Voltaire and Balzac and all these people sitting on my shelves. I feel like they're my buddies, you know, and I take them with me wherever I go. So thanks.
And also the muses that come to you, the one that taught you all about sci-fi and.
Oh yeah. Well, in the book there's these guys I call Hermes. You know, people walk up to you in a crowd and say something and walk away. It happens all the time. You don't really remember it, but it does. Well, I kept note of that over the years, but I didn't know what to call. What do you call somebody who steps out of a crowd and says, you know, 9 o'clock today something's going to happen? You know? And so I thought, once I lit on Hermes, and I know Terry's been reading up on all the mythology guys, but so I said, well, I'll call the guy Hermes. You know, in this particular story, I was injured badly in a car accident, and I was going to have to spend I'd been 6 weeks in bed, and I was going to have to go back for another 6 weeks. So I was at this bookstore. There was all these sci-fi novels, but I didn't know anything about sci-fi. But I got it. I'm lost. But sci-fi would be great. I had to spend 5 hours a day in a bathtub and all that stuff. So all of a sudden I turned around and there was this Vietnam vet standing behind me. And he goes, looks like you're interested in these. Would you like me to make a few suggestions? So he must have spent an hour walking me through all these titles. I left with like 20 books. And as I was leaving, it was raining. So walking outside, I got 20 books. And the guy walks up to me and he says, oh, by the way, to thank you for asking. And he hands me a book edited by Robert Heinlein. It is literally this big. And I go, okay. But he goes, to thank you for asking. And so that was a Hermes-like moment. You know, I never knew his name. I couldn't really describe him too well, but he spent those hundreds of hours I spent in that bathtub. He changed my life, you know. So those kind of little things can happen to you if your antennae are up and you're paying attention, and they're great to write about.
Well, I do want, we've been at it for a little while now, so I do want to sort of close on one final question for each of you. And it's, What do you wish you'd known about writing when you started out writing that you know now? What have you learned that makes the process, I won't say easier, but a little more maybe understandable? Aaron, you want to?
So I remember when I was in graduate school for creative writing, some friends of mine went to a reading by this writer named Scott Heim, who at the time his first book had just been turned into a film, and he had a new book coming out. And so somebody said in the audience, what advice do you have for young writers? And he was like, don't do it. And then they were sort of waiting for like, okay, that's the laugh line. What is the real? No, seriously, don't do it. Yeah. So I mean, it's a really it's a tough world out there, and it's always like the golden age of publishing was always like 10 years ago. You know, and it's kind of like that movie Midnight in Paris. It was always better like 10 years ago. Like when exactly was it good? But I would have to say that the greatest reward is that day in your office when you write one great sentence, and there will be nothing that will feel as good.
I think Yogi Berra described it beautifully. It's not over till it's over. You know, you write a page and you're really proud of it, and there's a few good ideas in there and a few decent sentences, but you're going to write that page 11, 20, 30 more times. You know, when I first started writing it, and I really was proud of that first page, and then I go, that's crap. And the second version is crap. And the third version is crap. And the 10th version is a little better, but it's still crap. And so love the process. You know, the advice is love the process. And if you have to do it 35 times, do it 35 times. If you get away with doing it 10, hey, you're good. But if you got to love the process, you got to love doing it. You know, and I think that's the same with any art form at all. You know, doing it over and over again makes you better, makes it better. So if you're a type A type personality and you think, well, I've already got 7 hours into this, well, good, spend 7 more and come back to me in the morning. You know, so I think that's and if you love the process, then you don't mind how long it takes. You know, because it's all a joy anyway.
Great, perfect. There's still some wine over there. There's still there's more wine being brought from the back. We were replenishing the wine as we speak. Please, if you haven't gotten copies of the books already, please go in the back corner and do so. And just thank you all so much for coming, and thank you.